Doom v Vamos Epicureans. This is the Marvel Epic Collection Podcast One-Shot Edition. I'm your host, Nick Smith, and I'll be joined by Stojr in just a moment. We are participating in Kurtis Findlay's Epic Marvel Podcast Reading Club, and this one-shot will be our brief thoughts on today's issue, which is Uncanny X Men number 153, Kitty's Fairy Tale. Dave Cockrum is returning on the art. Well, as the X-Men are cleaning up the mansion after their last battle, Kitty Pryde and Colossus settle down to tell Illyana Rasputin, Colossus's sister, a bedtime story. We get alternate fantasy versions of the X-Men as they journey through a fantasy world to stop the power of the Dark Phoenix. In the end, our cast of characters defeat that dark power, they restore the Phoenix to being just Jean Grey, and Jean marries the noble prince Scott Summers. All the while, as the story is being told, the real X-Men gather outside Illyana's door to hear the story, and they surprise Kitty and Colossus when they leave and Illyana finally falls asleep. Alright, this was a fun issue. There are a lot of little things to like about this one. The pastiche of each of the characters in this fantasy world was great. I particularly liked the Wolverine as the Fiend, who is eating cans of Coors and spitting out the can as if it were a cherry pit. Xavier as a wizard on a flying carpet was fun, and I liked Nightcrawler's the cartoony Bamf. I think I mentioned once before in one of our previous episodes that I remember reading some X-Men comics in the early 2000s that featured a lot of these Bamfs, and I didn't realize there was a precedent for them, even though the precedent is this fairy tale story. So now I'm kind of curious as to how those little Bamfs became a reality, but that's going to be down the line. Like I said, I recall, must have been 2004, 2005 when I was reading those. I remember the place and time, but I don't remember the exact issues. Speaking of precedents, we get our first appearance of Lockheed the Dragon. Now, Lockheed is an imaginary version of the X-Men's plane in this issue. This is the SR-71 Blackbird, which the real SR-71 Blackbird was created by the Lockheed Corporation, which merged with Martin Marietta in 1955 to form what is now the Lockheed Martin Corporation. We get a real Lockheed the Dragon later on in the X-Men who's Kitty's friend. This imaginary Lockheed here is given the name. And I had no idea that Lockheed's name directly came from the Blackbird. I did not know that we had this story. I'm sure I read it at some point because I read all these things 15 years ago, but I've forgotten about it. So Lockheed the Dragon actually being this direct relation to the Blackbird, I thought that was kind of neat and makes his name all the more neat anyway. Speaking of Lockheed, I like how he is portrayed here with his kind of surly personality. I'm kind of curious as to why he keeps calling Kitty Colleen. At first, I thought maybe this was a typo and Claremont was thinking of Colleen Wing, but Lockheed calls her Colleen twice, so that must have been intentional, I would have to assume. So I don't know, that I couldn't find anything online to explain that. There's other fun little details in here. I like that Kitty is wearing an ElfQuest shirt, which I've never read ElfQuest, but one of those comics I've always been kind of interested in, so maybe one of these days we'll get to ElfQuest. If I were to quibble about anything, I would think it's using Jean as the bad guy in this story, not so long after Jean's death, is maybe a little insensitive. I know it's played off with the happy ending where she marries Scott and Cyclops is appreciative in the end, but if this were reality, I can't imagine anyone using such a tragic event to be a bedtime story, honestly. Then again, Kitty joined the X-Men just as they were having Jean's funeral. She barely knew Jean. She did meet Jean, but she barely knew her. Maybe this didn't hit Kitty as hard. I don't know. Anyway, it's a harmless story regardless. I enjoyed it. Those are my thoughts. Let's pass this over to Stojr and see what he has to think.
Uncanny X Men number 153. This is something completely different, as the cover says, but is basically Kitty's fairy tale, where Kitty's telling a story, going through and sort of replacing the X-Men into her version of this fairy tale that she's got going on here. This issue's fine. I mean, it's a nice little departure from everything. There's a couple of interesting takeaways from this. I really did enjoy seeing Illyana a little bit as a little kid, and she's got a Fozzie bear in her bed, which is pretty cool. I think that the artwork in this issue is great. It's good to see Cochran back, even if he's getting a little bit of an assist here on the art duties. The depiction of Wolverine is kind of ridiculously silly. It's almost like a proto '90s Wolverine that they're showing here, which is a bit funny. And we get the first mention of Lockheed, even if it's not the Lockheed that we know today, as well as little Bamfs. And these things will be around in future stories with different origins and different story arcs or whatever you want to call it. But the fact that there's these little tiny stuffed animal sized night crawlers that are around and interacting with characters is something that the X-Men writers won't let go of anytime soon. So overall, I mean, I think it's a fun little side issue. I would have liked to see this more of like in an annual, or as like a backup story in some double-sized issue or something like that. But can't complain too much. It's also nice that they were able to bring Dark Phoenix back, even if it is just in a fantasy storyline, and kind of have these little alternate universe takes on these characters. So not a terrible issue, but not one that I'll remember long after kind of flipping through and reading this.
All right, thank you, Stojr, and thank you, the audience, for watching and listening. We'll be back again tomorrow with another one-shot, and you can check us out on YouTube, where we post the episode schedules and currently have a poll for you to choose which Epic Collection we will read and review in March. Check that out, and go ahead and subscribe to this channel if you like what we're doing. I put Stojr and my link trees in the description if you ever want to find us on the internet. So thanks again, and we'll catch you next time for another episode that will be just as epic.